Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Today I'm talking to my friend Daniel Hannan, who is a member of the House of Lords in the UK, a prominent member of the Conservative Party, and a classical liberal. We're going to ask him whether or not the UK government can actually extradite Elon Musk for thought crimes. Check it out. Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Daniel, good to see you again in interesting times.
Yes, it's always a pleasure to see you, my dear Matt. Thank you for doing this. And thank you for everything you're doing to make the liberty cause look sophisticated and smart and sexy.
So I want my viewers to get a measured sense for what's going on in the UK right now, and as you probably know, we are seeing I believe your police commissioner making idle threats to Elon Musk that he will be extradited for thought crimes on X, and there's riots and there's beach police and there's all sorts of chaos going on. But I would start by observing that our tradition of free speech and the origins of the Declaration of Independence and the First Amendment actually are rooted in English common law. What is the difference between the American ethos of free speech and where the UK has been and where you are today?
That's a great question. I think you hinted at the answer. It is the First Amendment. A lot of, I would not describe myself so much as a free speech absolutist as a First Amendment absolutist. Congress shall make no law, right? So the distinction in common law is not exactly between words and deeds, because there are some things that are plainly words, but that are illegal in your jurisdiction or mine or anyone else's. For example, trying to obtain money through the threat of violence. It's only words, but it's plainly illegal. Or incitement, saying, let's go and beat up that guy Kibbe, and getting a mob together, and you then stand there and watch. Under any normal common law jurisdiction, those are crimes. So it's not a sort of sticks and stones thing. It's about criminalizing opinions, and this is I think is where the First Amendment, and you are very, very lucky to have it, has meant that the United States has not followed the general drift of every other country in the Anglosphere since the 90s into a more illiberal position based really around the imagined sensitivities of minorities. I mean, that's fundamentally what almost all the restrictions boil down to. But it's happened in Australia, it's happened in Canada, and as you can see, it's happening in the United Kingdom.
It's ironic or prescient. George Mason got it right, and we of course had a debate about whether or not we needed the Bill of Rights because it was all in their minds. It was all laid out in limits on government in the Constitution, and we went ahead and did it anyway. But it turns out to have been a very good idea.
Yes, he's completely vindicated. I mean, of course, the critics were logically correct, right? Because there is something slightly weird about saying, anything that is not specified in this constitution, the government cannot do. But here are some things that are extra prohibited, right? I mean, there's definitely a logical inconsistency there. But George Mason was right. I'd like, if I may, though, to go back to where you came in about the police, because I think this is a slight difference between your country and mine, and indeed between my country and almost everywhere else. One of the things that I'm very grateful for in the United Kingdom is the principles on which our police were established 2 centuries ago by a man called Sir Robert Peel, who, after founding the police, went on to found the Conservative Party. He had quite a busy life, and was the first great, really free trading prime minister anywhere in the world. His big idea was that the cop should be a citizen in uniform with no more powers than you or me, except insofar as those powers are temporarily and contingently bestowed on him by a magistrate. So he was very conscious of not wanting a police force in the way that any other country in the world had at that time, Prussia or Russia or France or Spain, where it was a kind of a paramilitary force, a gendarmerie, right? He wanted an approachable, and he had these principles saying, prevention is always better than prosecution. Put yourself in a position where the population will trust you and want to tell you stuff. Always try and diffuse a situation before you barge in. And by and large, this has worked extremely well. And the relationship between the police and the population is much better here than, as I say, even in a lot of the countries that are culturally very close. Famously, our police don't carry weapons. I think that began seriously to come under strain during the lockdown because the laws were so extreme, much more here than I think even in California. The police kind of got into the habit of insolence, of assuming that it was for them to tell you that you were walking too slowly or sitting on a park bench or talking to another person out of doors or whatever. And the powers slightly went to their head. And I think what we're seeing now is difficult to imagine had we not gone through those 18 to 20 months of disproportionate, and then once the BLM protest began, also very asymmetrical policing. And I think that's opened the door to a lot of things which are now coming to torment us.
Yeah, it strikes me that I mean that I didn't know all of that, but that philosophy certainly resonates with me. That policing should be not such a paramilitary experience, and the basis for such a system functioning would be general respect for the rule of law and trust that the system
Right.
is fair and equally implemented. And yes, you're right. I mean, we had, I think, a lot of the mistrust of policing in our country and amongst, frankly, conservatives is this imbalance between who was locked down and who was not locked down. We famously, and I think this happened in your country too, we had the same doctors and epidemiologists telling us that we had to be basically quarantined in our own homes, not allowed to travel, not allowed to cross state lines, not allowed to go to work. And in the midst of this, the BLM riots were celebrated as both safe and effective ways to protest government policies. The hypocrisy of that has done tremendous damage.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, Matt, in a crowded field, and there are a lot of candidates for this, I think the single craziest moment in lockdown was when 1,200 public health officials in the US put their names to a public letter saying that it was okay to break lockdown provided it was done in the name of BLM. Right? That because racism is a bigger threat to public health than COVID, and this utter madness then crossed the channel. We've got a very bad habit here of picking up the craziest of your identity politics, and indeed talking as if we were Americans in this sense. So, almost all racial questions in this country are now seen through a US prism, right? So if you're a white conservative, you're called a Klansman. If you're a black conservative, you're called an Uncle Tom. I mean, what's any of this got to do with us? By the way, I'm speaking to you from Hampshire. I mean, what's it even got to do with you in New Hampshire, right? The segregationist South was a very anomalous subculture within the Anglosphere. My friend, the historian Ed West, had a nice phrase where he said it was about as typical as Sparta was of ancient Greece, right? And yet we all now have adopted this language, and you hear British people talking about things like all white juries. Like, I mean, like, in this part of the country, what the hell else are they going to be, right? And apart from anything else, the 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 big ethnic minority here is South Asian. We do have black people, but there are more than twice as many people of South Asian as of black heritage. But the story of the black people it couldn't be further removed from that of. I mean, they came here generally from the Caribbean after the war. They'd often been in military uniform. That was why they'd come to know the place. And they weren't even immigrants. They were moving from one British territory to another. By the way, in search of work. It's become, for some reason that I cannot understand, it's become, I don't know, somehow disrespectful to say they came honestly and creditably because they wanted a better life for their families. We have to pretend that they were coming to rebuild after the war, help build up the NHS, as though they were kind of, I don't know, kind of poverty tourists. There is no dishonor in coming. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. My point is, we adopted totally the attitude of those 1,200 public health loons. And suddenly, from one day to the next, the police who had been feeling your collar for, standing too close to a friend in your garden were suddenly not just okay with BLM protests, but were taking the knee in a performative way. We had a very senior policeman recording a video saying, I'd rather you didn't break the law, but if you do feel compelled to come out and protest, then please try and do it considerately, without violence. I mean, it's unbelievable. And you can't, I'm afraid, just pretend that you didn't see any of that. I mean, a lot of people have done a lot of that with a lot of the lockdown, but we can't unsee the readiness of the police to be partial. The great F.A. Hayek, one of my favorite Hayek lines is where he said, laws must be general, equal, and certain, right? Laws, I mean, it's the most basic point. Justice is blind. Laws have to be general, equal, and certain. And I'm afraid in lockdown, if you compared the way anti-lockdown demonstrators were treated to the way BLM demonstrators were treated, it was impossible to avoid the conclusion that we were seeing two-tier policing. And that has carried on since, right? So in the time since the lockdown, we've had, eco-protesters being surprisingly, until very, very recently, surprisingly gently handled. We've had these pro-Palestine or anti-Israel marches again being policed with kid gloves. There was a woman who went into a Cambridge college and slashed with a knife to ribbons a portrait of Balfour, the former Conservative Prime Minister, because he'd signed the Balfour Declaration, paving the way for a Jewish state. She was on camera. I mean, she films herself doing it. The police haven't arrested her, haven't charged her. And all of this can only serve to damage the authority and legitimacy of the law. And which, of course, then brings us to the unrest we saw, earlier this month.
Make sure people understand what happened from your perspective, because there's all sorts of social media versions of the story, but you give us the real story as best you know it.
I'll give you the facts as best as I can, and I'm afraid these are facts that reflect very poorly on absolutely everyone. It began with a horrible tragedy. I mean, one of those really unthinkable things where there was a dance class, a Taylor Swift themed dance class for little girls, and a disturbed 17-year-old went in with a knife and murdered 3 of these little children, injured several of the others, injured the teacher and a passerby who tried to put themselves between him and the kids. And normally in this country, you are not allowed to name a suspect who is a legal minor. In other words, who is under the age of 18. In this case, it happened, partly because he was only a week off his 18th birthday, and partly because not naming him had caused a problem. So it turns out he was a guy born in the UK of Rwandan parents, who, I mean, impossible to work out what's going on in someone's mind when they're carrying out something as monstrous as that. But within hours, there was a rumor online that the perpetrator was in fact a Muslim who had come illegally to the country as an asylum seeker across the channel. And this led to a protest or the hijacking of a vigil for the little girls by some violent elements locally, that was then replicated in other northern cities. A lot of the people who have so far been charged, actually, when you look at them, they are habitual criminals, right? These are not far-right demonstrators. They're not political activists of any kind. They are people with a long history of preying on their communities. They've often got several previous convictions for violence, for assault, for threatening and abusive behavior. But there is a feeling, because of the uneven policing I was talking about earlier, that they've been treated unduly harshly. That because the Prime Minister keeps on talking, he's always framing this as defending communities against the far right. Communities, I should explain, is the collectivist Labour euphemism for ethnic minorities, because obviously they can only be understood by Labour as communities, not as individuals with their own aspirations. And all of this has led to this feeling that these protesters are being more harshly treated than people who have, than BLM protesters or environmental protesters or anti-Israel protesters. Now, I said at the beginning, no one comes out of this well. One of the lot of people who do not come out of this well are people who are normally law and order conservatives, but who are now saying, well, come on, this is a bit excessive. I mean, look, I don't know about you. In my view, disorder, property crimes, punching a policeman, setting fire to a building, you should expect a lengthy prison term. I mean, I don't care why you're doing it. I don't care whether it's anti-Israel or anti-immigration. That's just a straightforward question of maintaining public order. But we've seen, as so often happens on these occasions, we've seen this 180-degree turn, where the people who normally say that, the status quo conservatives, the law and order people, are dangerously close to, okay, not excusing the violence, but contextualizing it and quasi-justifying it. And the people who normally say crime is really all about deprivation and poverty, and prison isn't the answer, and way too many convicts, and we've got to find more, suddenly are saying lock them up and throw away the key. Right now, actually, it's what an economist would call a revealed preference, right? If the people now saying, because these are racists who they don't like, the people now saying lock away the key, if they really thought that prison didn't work, they wouldn't be saying it, right? So we see that actually incapacitating criminals is often quite a good way of containing crime.
Regular viewers of Kibbe on Liberty already know how obsessed I have been with the pandemic industrial complex and all of the stupid, authoritarian, and downright evil things that the government did to us during COVID-19. Well, I'm proud to announce a new investigative series that looks to get to the bottom of all of that. It's called The Coverup, and I'm producing it in cooperation with BlazeTV. The only place you're going to see this is BlazeTV, so go to FauciCoverup.com/Kibbe and use the code FauciLied for $30 off your annual subscription. Do it now. The truth is out there. We have the same dynamic, and I know you've written about this. I just had a reporter who's been caught up in the Justice Department sweep over January 6th. And there is a sweep to not only punish the people who committed crimes, violence and destruction of property at the Capitol on January 6th, but anyone that happened to be there, many of whom obviously thought that they were peacefully protesting. And I think the way that conservatives see it is they start to apologize for the actual bad actors because they see the entire sweep as unjust. And again, you're just seeing the corrosion of the rule of law and the credibility of law enforcement because it is radically politicized as opposed to actually trying to met out justice based on the actions of individuals. So it's maybe we exported this to you as well. I know you're a free trader, but maybe our intersectional politics is something that the UK should not have imported.
Yes, I mean that is one import I could have gladly done without. I mean, the last time you and I spoke, which was in Bretton Woods last year, uh, I remember we discussed this worrying trend of people elevating process over outcome, not caring about the rules when they favour a particular victory. The way it's become almost automatic now for the loser of an election to go to court, and that I think is. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's a new thing or that it's crossed the Atlantic. I actually think that that's a very natural way for human beings instinctively to react. And the extraordinary thing is that the US, particularly, and the wider English-speaking world, managed has managed for as long as it has to not do that, and to teach people to elevate abstract principles, and to adhere to the Constitution even if their guy loses. But all of this depends at least on the forces of the state being impartial, right? We can put up with a certain number of voters not getting it. We can put up with a certain number of your conservative friends and mine, contextualizing and justifying violence in a way that really, they should know better. What I think is much harder to put up with is either the courts or the police not being predictable and uniform in their behavior. And that I really do think is the difference between a law-based country and a tin pot dictatorship. And I mean, there's only so many elections that you can go around demanding that you lock up the loser, before the US starts resembling Guatemala or somewhere, right? I mean, somebody has to make the case for standing by the rules, even when the other guys win.
And by the way, that the and this is why I want to get to the new seemingly more radical push for censorship in the UK. Tyrants are the ones that benefit from all of this chaos. One of the and we could talk about social media as well, but it is very much the case that I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but opportunists who would love to continue the censorship that was exposed by the X files in the United States, the Twitter files, now X. They seem to want this regiment of determining what is allowed to be said, what is not allowed to be said, and it's wrapped in the language of public safety, but it's really about controlling your political critics. What is going on with the new Labor government? Your new prime minister seems to be. We have a saying in the United States: "Hold my beer." He's saying, "Hold my pint." I'm going to do censorship really, really hard now.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if your viewers will have seen, I'm sure they have if they're on X, the bizarre, deranged letter from the European Commissioner Thierry Breton threatening Elon Musk, right? And I mean, one thing that I hope will come out of that is I hope Americans will now understand why we left the EU, right? This was not some nativist protectionist kick. We are responding. We were reacting to a mode of thought that we found very alien.
I want to give you a quick shout out for people that don't remember this. You successfully put yourself out of a job as a member of the European Parliament for UK as an advocate of Brexit, and this was one of your arguments for getting out.
Yes, and I have, and it remains the thing I'm proudest of in my public life, and I have no doubt that it was the right thing to do. Although I am disappointed at how slow we've been to seize the opportunities that opened up afterwards. And this is actually a very good example of that, right? Here you have a European Union that is increasingly not interested in the free flow of information and ideas, that is more concerned about safetyism and censorship than about the opportunities that come from the World Wide Web. And we see the same in its approach to AI. We see the same in its approach actually to tech generally, right? Hence its constant disputes with US tech giants, which are almost always about some elements of the EU wanting state control. Now, here is an opportunity for Britain to say, well, thank God we don't need to be part of that anymore. If you guys really do want to go back to the kind of censorship that characterized a lot of your countries within living memory, we can't stop you. But we're going to remain true to our own traditions. And, we're the country of John Milton and J.S. Mill, and we're going to encourage a cacophony of different ideas so that the truth will emerge through a free market, right? That would be a classic approach. I'm afraid that just isn't the way Starmer sees things. I think you can very easily see the UK following the EU, partly because he always wants to follow the EU, but partly because, like a lot of American leftists, I think he sees things fundamentally through the prism of identity politics. And again, I've noticed that it's become a sort of sacralized way of measuring any question, So if you have a dispute about, I don't know, free association, almost immediately someone says, well, but would it be okay for a private club to turn down a black member just because, hang on. First of all, is that really a likely thing in this day and age? But second, even if it is, that's that's not how you should approach the abstract question, right? And in the same way, whenever you talk about free speech, it's almost within seconds you're down to, but is it okay for people to say racist things? Well, honestly, that isn't really the relevant question, right? The relevant question is there a need to go beyond the well-established common law principles that we have that already punish incitement and already punish public disorder? Uh, you know, do we need to go beyond that to protect people from hurt feelings? And I think that the instinct of the Labour government is that we do. And I say that because the only pro free speech law passed by my party in the 14 years that we were in office, the only one was a law providing for free speech on campus. And it was a proportionate law aimed at remedying a specific and identified problem, which was the shutting down, A, the shutting down of visiting speakers, and B, in some cases, the harassment of members of faculty by other faculty members and students because of opinions unrelated to their jobs. So we'd passed a law. Basically, it didn't invent any new rights, but it provided an enforcement mechanism for people who'd suffered in this way. The first act of the Labour government was to suspend the entry into force of this law that was due to come in about a week after the election. So I think we can see where they're coming from on this. And I'm afraid that going back to where you started, the US is increasingly looking like an outlier. I think because of the genius of Madison and the people who came out with the Bill of Rights.
Yes, we're more protected. Although I have been saying since lockdown, since March of 2020, I've been shocked at how leaky our Constitution and Bill of Rights proved in an emergency. And I think a lot of this speech policing, this desire amongst authoritarians, left or right, for consensus. Consensus is code for my opinions, not yours. The desire to shut down dissent really didn't start, but it really exploded during lockdowns with the censorship of anyone that criticized the lockdown culture. And this seems to be a simple extension of that we're going to we're going to push for consensus, and consensus is determined by the ruling class, not by this open conversation, this marketplace for ideas that we sort of idealize with social media.
So that is definitely a growing problem. Shut up and follow the science. It's unpatriotic even to ask a question, to indeed apply the scientific method, reason and debate and trial, experimentation. But I think that is allied to what is really best understood as a blasphemy law. It's been over 100 years in this country since the last actual imprisonment for blasphemy. Disturbed young man was making extreme claims about Jesus. That is now unthinkable, right? You can be as obscene as you like, and there's no law against it. Try making an equivalent remark about George Floyd, and you'll see that the response is not driven by incitement concerns or public order concern, but is effectively blasphemy. The reason I say that is that there was a case here where a former policeman was convicted for making a nasty joke about George Floyd on a private WhatsApp group. Okay, so there was no consideration that he was starting a riot or anything. That isn't what blasphemy laws are about, right? Blasphemy laws are about punishing the impiety. It doesn't matter whether anyone else heard it. It's so offensive that we need to get inside your head and stop you thinking that, because it's what the Greeks called asebeia. You're mocking the gods. And I wonder sometimes in my gloomier moments whether the last couple of 100 years, which we thought of as the kind of culmination of a liberal and open order, that as we became more educated and richer and more literate, we would naturally become more individualist, and we'd accept that you could disagree with people without needing to shut them up and all that. I wonder whether it isn't beginning to look now a bit more like an interregnum between two different kinds of ruling ideologies, between the old religious one and now the new identitarian one. And what seemed like the golden age of J.S. Mill was actually just a kind of stasis, because neither side exactly controlled the commanding heights, and therefore each had to control the other. I was very struck by this when my daughter, who recently graduated, so I can now tell you the story without endangering her. My elder daughter was reading languages at Oxford, and her college said, you are required as a condition of doing this course to do this kind of white privilege online survey, where effectively it was a sort of questionnaire where the correct answer on every single one was it's white people's fault. Never mind the inadequacy of the survey. What's that got to do with doing a degree in French or linguistics, right? I mean, what conceivable connection? Well, here's the thing. 200 years ago, in order to matriculate at Oxford University, which obviously you had to be male, so she couldn't have done it, but had she been a boy, this is almost incredible to us, but you had to swear an oath eschewing the doctrine of transubstantiation. So you literally, as a condition of being allowed to matriculate, had to say, I, Matt Kibbe, do solemnly swear that the bread and wine used in the communion are only symbolic and are not the real body and blood of our Lord, right? Now, what's that got to do with doing a French degree? Precisely as much or precisely as little as the white privilege, right? And what is amazing is how few undergraduates can see this. When I say this to people of my daughter's age, they go, what are you talking about? How can you compare those two things? One is a nasty anti-Catholic bit of bigotry. The other is about protecting minorities. And they're so in the matrix. And that's what makes me think maybe those 200 years in between were a bubble. Maybe they were this sunlit period between the two, it was an interglacial. There was an ice age on either side, which is a pretty terrifying thought.
I want to tell you about this new brand that we love here at Free the People. Our friend Jennifer Say, free speech warrior and truth teller, has started her own athletic clothing brand. It's called Xxy Athletics, and it is the only athletic brand standing up for women's sports. We met Jen when she spoke out against the insanity of COVID lockdowns and school closures, and stood up for our freedoms. She risked her reputation to do the right thing, and she's doing it again now. A lot of other brands out there claim to champion women, but only Jen actually does it with her new brand, Xxy Athletics. As a former elite gymnast, she was the 1986 national champion. She knows the importance of protecting Title IX. And as the former Levi's brand president, she knows a thing or two about great products. Xxy Athletics just launched their performance wear for both men and women, including cool t-shirts, bike shorts, and leggings. So check it out at xx-xyathletics.com or thetruthfits.com. Don't give your money to athletic brands who don't share your values. Give it to a brand that speaks truth, stands up for free speech, and puts quality first. Use the code Kibbe75 and you'll get free shipping with orders of $75 or more. Finally, an athletic brand with a cause you can get behind. Go show XXXY Athletics some love. Wear the truth out loud. Go to xx-xyathletics.com and use the code Kibbe75. That's KIBBE75 to order. Do it now. I have to show you my, relevant to this, my Anthony Fauci prayer candle, because I've been arguing since at least 2021, maybe 2020, that criticizing the science and Anthony Fauci was not an act of free speech in their minds, as an act of blasphemy, and they had replaced other forms of religion with this dogged support of the science, which actually goes back to the history of socialism. But I want to drill down on this point, because this is a debate I have every day. Was human liberty and flourishing an anomaly, or can we expect to work our way through this process and get to even greater liberty? And when I'm an optimist, I will argue that social media has created tremendous opportunity for us to understand things and get information and seek knowledge and to self-organize in ways that was inconceivable a generation ago, where we very much depended on top-down authorities, not just government, but all of our institutions were very top-down. And are we in the middle of a paradigm change that looks like an unraveling, when in fact what we're really trying to figure out is how to associate in a radically democratized way that was just inconceivable a generation ago? Or is it in fact an unraveling that leads to a new techno-authoritarianism? I can make both arguments, but I want to believe in the wisdom of crowds and the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment. Are you an optimist or a pessimist about this?
I have the same dilemma. I mean, it's a little bit like the argument that is sometimes used against religion, by the sort of Ricky Gervais type argument, which is, the laws of physics could be rediscovered and they'd be the same. Whereas if Scientology disappeared, it would never be reinvented in the same form. Is the success of open liberal capitalist societies so obvious that the formula is out there now, and even if there were some dark ages, people could rediscover it? They've got the cookery book, they've got the ingredients, and they know what makes it. I'd like to think that, but then I keep coming back to how at odds with human nature your creed and mine is. It seems to me extraordinary that anyone could make a hero out of Vladimir Putin, that anyone could want to live in a society where you can be arrested without any questions being asked simply because the regime doesn't like you. But actually, there are lots of people who admire him. There are lots of people who have no problem with that, who think that, we've forgotten patriotism and service and faith and sacrifice, and we've become greedy and materialistic, and we don't care about what's important. There is always this inner caveman protesting against the Enlightenment. And I wonder whether, if we lose it, it is actually going to be revived. Jefferson, in one of his letters, said democracy is going to work as long as people are informed, as long as people have access to the facts. And for the first couple of hundred years after he said that, or nearly the first couple of hundred years, it looked like a very solid observation, because People were becoming more informed. The population was becoming more literate. The price of printing fell. Then broadcasting was invented. People were gaining more and more data, spending more time in school. I wonder whether there's a point where you reach saturation, where you've got more data than ever before, but you've lost the filters. You've lost the ability to apply the normal criteria of, is this plausible? Is this impartial? Is this compatible with what the same source was saying 5 minutes ago about something else? Is it logically consistent? I wonder whether, just to come over slightly sort of Jonathan Haidt for a moment, I wonder whether the saturation of social media, especially for kids who have grown up with it, who never knew anything else, hasn't slightly damaged our discernment and made us more credulous, as well as more impatient and more short-tempered. And I think a lot of what is going wrong in politics is that we're seeing politics in the age of a smartphone. People aren't prepared to countenance trade-offs. They're not prepared to allow that someone they don't like might still have something useful to tell them. They're not prepared to see their opponents as patriots who are doing their best. They have to be evil. And although those things were always there, I can't help feeling they have been accelerated by the fact that everyone now, we're scrolling through politics like people scroll through TikTok, right, with 7 seconds on each video.
Yeah. I think that is obviously true in our current snapshot of where we are in terms of seeking information and trying to figure out what is going on. And going back to the impetus of the riots, I do think that the lack of credibility in corporate media is well earned, and I think a lot of people realized that they were being sold a narrative that was simply not factually true. And I go all the way back to, I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite telling me that's the way it is. And I like, in a lot of ways, I like the chaos. This is my optimistic side coming out again. And, Elon Musk, if he was here, he would say, well, we have community notes that seem to do a pretty good job of fact-checking people that make false statements. And I think that process, it's almost a market process of trying to figure stuff out, is still functioning. But when people sort of react to a meme without giving it a moment's consideration that it might be completely fictitious, that is fundamentally one of the problems we're having today. But I still think it might be better than the old paradigm where the powers that be just lied to us and they controlled the narrative from the top down.
Right. I mean, that's the question, right? When people say social media have put us in silos, I mean, really, guys, we had very, very politically aligned newspapers in this country. Our papers are almost all national rather than local. It's not like in the US. But if you read only the Daily Mail or you read only the Guardian, you'd never have opposing points of view thrust at you in the way that you necessarily do on social media. And if anything, the spread of social media, it seems to me, I don't know if this is the case in the US as well, has made the legacy media more clickbaity and more partial than they were before, because they're also rewarding people with immediate dopamine hits by confirming their prejudices. There was it's going back to the BLM riots during the lockdown. There was an absolutely classic BBC headline which just sort of summarized the whole corporate dishonesty of that whole era, which was 27 police injured in largely peaceful protest. And there was this absolute determination to repress what was happening, which social media made impossible. Elon Musk would argue, and he'd be right, that something similar happened over the recent riots. So once these sort of numbskulls were attacking mosques and refugee hostels and so on, groups of British Muslims began to form equally unpleasant mobs of their own. And the legacy media wouldn't, it was too complicated because they had a simple narrative of horrible right-wing people attacking sort of Bill Cosby type minorities, right? Actually, sorry, Bill Cosby is now the wrong, but you get those innocent, right? And this culminated in actually a really quite funny moment on Sky News, where a reporter was giving this line, terrified local communities, being hunted down by these dreadful right-wing extremists, when a masked British Asian man comes up and swears at her, threatens her, and then one of his friends is later filmed slashing the tires on her car, and the camera kind of cuts away, and the anchor makes some embarrassed throat clearing noises, and so Elon Musk would say, if it were not for X, we wouldn't really have seen that going on at all, and that's probably true. So, these things are almost never 100% one way or the other. But I just wish that there were a way of preparing people. Maybe it's a question of keeping them off phones until they're a bit older, or keeping them off social media until their brains are fully developed. It's horrifying when you see young kids doing this, but the readiness to believe the most implausible gibberish simply because it confirms your negative prejudices about people you don't like. And therefore, the readiness of almost everyone to put that kind of material out because it's rewarded. I can't see how that is helping us maintain a balanced political system where winners show restraint and losers display consent.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love Liberty and look cool. Yeah. I want to, before we wrap up, I want to get your take on the recent elections, and I want to start with a theory that I have, and I mentioned earlier I'm coming to your neck of the woods this fall to interview the great Matt Ridley on as part of our new series, The Coverup, which exposes the truth about the science, Wuhan lockdowns, that whole thing that I've been complaining about for almost this entire hour. And my question for him, and my question for you, and my theory is that you had Brexit, and you had the ascendancy of Boris Johnson, and it felt like in a lot of ways the conservative moment in the UK, and lockdowns and Boris Johnson's response to lockdowns destroyed all of that, and perhaps ultimately culminated in the trouncing that your party just had. Is that a plausible story, or is there other things at play? Obviously, there's other things at play here.
100%. You have the situation exactly. You've displayed a much finer grasp of what has happened here than most British political commentators, even down to the paying of praise for Matt Ridley. Matt and Alina Chan's book is somewhere on the shelves behind me here. I mention that only because it ought to have sold many more copies than it did. I'm guessing you read it. I think it is unarguable. He demonstrates his case, I think, beyond any shadow of a doubt. But it hasn't sold nearly as many copies as it should have done, because the scientific establishment found it embarrassing because it contradicted what they'd said at the time, and here was this kind of amateur being smarter than all of them. And the general public were like, well, duh, of course it was a lab leak. I mean, I don't need to read a book to tell me that. I mean, come on, Wuhan, right? And so it sort of fell between the two stools. But coming to your main point, this has happened to almost every incumbent government in the world. there was a moment at the height of lockdown when authoritarian governments were popular. They were dominating the media. They were on the news every evening, giving these kind of statesman-like accounts of what you had to do. And as we discovered during lockdown, people are terrifyingly illiberal, and this was all incredibly popular. I can think of two Anglosphere leaders who were just sly enough to spot that moment and use it. One was Justin Trudeau in Canada, and one was Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Both of them seized the moment when the lockdown was still on and were handsomely re-elected. Once the bills come in, whole different story. And around the world, governments have been struggling against a bizarre amnesia from voters who themselves not only favoured the lockdown, but in most cases wanted it to carry on when it was eventually wound up. So people, certainly in the run-up to the most recent election here, earlier this year, they were talking about the inflation and the tax rises as though they'd come out of thin air, as though they were some mark of an incompetent government that couldn't run an economy, without any recognition that for the better part of 2 years, we paid people to stay at home and we printed money to cover the difference. And the reason that they didn't acknowledge that is because, 93% of people, if the opinion polls are to be believed, had favoured the first lockdown. 85% favoured the second one. And unbelievably, 71% wanted it to carry on when Boris Johnson finally lifted the restrictions. So here was this extraordinary paradox that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were more anti-lockdown than 9 people in 10, but who said that politics was fair, right? Rather than confronting the costs of the policies that they were themselves demanding, most voters will say, well, that's your fault, it's your job, you're the politicians, and you've messed this up. I'm sending for someone else. Even if that someone else wanted a longer lockdown, and in fact, with Keir Starmer, we'd probably still be locked down. He opposed every loosening of the restrictions when they happened. So, politics is a very unfair business sometimes, and a great communicator can get around that. Reagan could have done, maybe Boris could have done if he'd still been there. Rishi Sunak couldn't, and he was swept away like so many others.
The exception, like Trudeau, is obviously still in power, and I don't know what his political fates are. I haven't looked at the polling, but happily, Ardern was swept out, just like Boris Johnson.
The polling in Canada is terrific. Pierre Poilievre is the leader of the Conservative Party. He is literally my favorite politician in the world right now, in terms of his intelligence, his integrity, and his ideology. He totally gets what's gone wrong. He's turned monetary policy into a populist cause there. I've watched small town Canadian audiences hang on his words as he explains the causes of inflation. He's got this amazing sort of slightly geeky charisma. And much more important than that, he's got a very clear sense of what he wants to do. And the last time I looked, it was getting on for 20 points ahead in the polls. So, there is a place for us all to flee if the rest of the world goes wrong.
Yes, I mean, a driving distance for me, at least. So that's encouraging. Perhaps I should pay more attention to Canadian politics. Well, this has been very informative, and I really appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to getting together this fall when I'm in your neck of the woods.
I will look forward to having tea with you then, my dear Matt, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.